Hey, this is Dane from featherprop.com. Thanks for joining me today again in this video. I was going to call this episode The Mysterious Life and Death of Sergei Kourdakov, but decided instead to call it The Mysterious Life of Sergei Kourdakov. I will deal with his death in another episode. If this is something that interests you, then you may want to subscribe to this channel, and don't forget to click the little notification bell so that you're alerted when a new video is posted and the follow-up video is posted to this one. If you know nothing about Sergei Kourdakov, well, hang on. I'll do my best to bring you up to speed. So let's get on with it. Sergei Kourdakov was born March 1st, 1951 in the Soviet Union. Although that's where the story begins for him, we will begin on September 3rd, 1971. It was on that date that Sergei Kourdakov was aboard a Soviet trawler serving as a naval officer. A violent storm had forced the ship to seek safety within Canadian waters. There, Sergei made a very daring and desperate bid for freedom. Taking only a few personal items, he jumped from the deck of the ship to the cold Pacific waters off the coast of the Canadian province of British Columbia. His goal was to seek political asylum, escape from the Soviet Union, and build a new life in the West. Depending upon what source you read, Sergei spent somewhere between 5 and 8 hours in the cold waters swimming in that vicious storm. Although he was in superb physical condition and an excellent swimmer, Sergei claims his watery salvation to the fact that he had cried out to God to save him. Given the conditions that he endured, it would seem that only divine intervention could have rescued Sergei. Somehow, despite the odds, he made it to shore. After climbing a 200-foot cliff, he collapsed and was discovered by a local woman who notified authorities. Almost immediately upon being rescued, Sergei made a claim for political asylum. A number of very tense weeks followed in which it was not clear if he would be granted freedom or be returned to the Soviet Union. As he waited his fate, he remained in a Vancouver jail and was interviewed by a number of journalists. He described himself as having become disillusioned with life in the Soviet Union. But beyond that, he didn't go into any great public detail of his life behind the Iron Curtain. On September 22nd, 1971, Sergei was granted asylum and was told that he could remain in Canada. He was a free man. As of 1971, in December, a newspaper article reported that he was quietly studying English in Toronto. Now, I want to fast forward to where Sergei's story intersects mine. In December 2016, I had been loaned a copy of Sergei's autobiography, The Persecutor. As soon as I began to read the story, I felt as though I was mesmerized. I had never heard such a story before. Sergei told of growing up as an orphan in the Soviet Union and being introduced to violence as a way of life quite early. He told how he had become a member of the communist youth and how he had quickly risen through its ranks. His communist loyalty won him awards and the attention of the Communist Party. He joined the military and was an officer cadet when he reportedly was contacted by the secret police. Sergei was asked to form an elite squad of young men who would join him on clandestine raids. These raids were against what were described as enemies of the state, or as he was to find out, against Christians. For about 2 years, Sergei described leading more than 150 of these raids. He wrote how he and his men would burst into homes where Christians were gathering in secret. They would beat the men and women with their fists or clubs, make arrests, and confiscate their material. He reported that at least 2 women and 1 man, a pastor, had succumbed to their injuries from these violent raids and had died. One of the women that his group was reported to have beaten was a young girl by the name of Natasha. She was left semi-conscious from the raid. 3 days later, Sergei wrote how he and his men had led another raid into another home only to find Natasha there again. Sergei recorded how he personally beat her this time until, and I quote, her skin began to blister. About a week later, Sergei wrote that he and his men conducted yet another raid of a secret prayer meeting, only to find Natasha there again. So bewildered were they to find her that one of Sergei's men actually stepped in to protect her from being beaten. Seeing Natasha for a third time at a meeting left Sergei feeling bewildered. He suggested how this left an impact on him, and that it may have begun a tiny crack in his otherwise tough exterior. The next day, while burning Christian literature that had been confiscated, Kourdakov described how he had found a handwritten copy of the Gospel of Luke. He tucked it in his pocket and would later begin reading it. In time, he described how the conflict within him was now so great that he didn't know how he could even go on. On Sunday, October 18th, 1970, Sergey would go on his final raid. They burst into a home and began to beat the Christians gathered there for prayer. As Sergey lifted his club to strike an elderly woman, he heard her suddenly pray for forgiveness for him. Enraged, Sergey described beginning to swing his club at her head when he felt someone grab his wrist and pull his arm backward. He said he wheeled around and was shocked to find no one there. He dropped his club and ran out of the house crying. Sergey appealed to his superiors and asked for time off from the raids. He returned to the Naval Academy, graduated, and was ordered to sea. He sailed from Russia on March 4th, 1970, never to see his homeland again. Like so many before me, I was deeply impacted by Sergey's story. His autobiography may have been the most powerful book I had ever read. And the whole time I was reading it, I kept asking myself how I had never heard of this man before. I had been running in Christian circles for decades and was perplexed that I had never come across the name Sergei Kourdakov. It was only as I turned to the final pages of the book that I learned the shocking truth. Sergey had died of a fatal gunshot wound to the head in a California motel room on January 1st, 1973, just 2 months shy of his 22nd birthday. Ironically, I'm shooting this video on the 48th anniversary of his death. Immediately upon finishing the autobiography, I began looking for more information on Sergey. I just wasn't ready to accept that the story was closed. Surely there was more to his account. It was then that I came across the book A Rose for Sergey by author Kay Kidd. I highly recommend this book to anyone who has an interest in Sergey's story. Ms. Kidd had a brief, very innocent romance with Sergey when they had met in Washington, D.C. She wrote about her time with him and some of the things that he had shared with her about his past. During the Christmas season of 1972, she traveled to visit family in Massachusetts while Sergey went to California. There had been some talk of possible marriage, and the relationship seemed to be serious. However, on January 1st, 1973, author Kay Kidd received the devastating news that Sergey was dead. I read her book in 2 days and was still very fixed on his story. It was a wonderful book. Again, I recommend it. Wanting to know more, I continued on my research. This led me to a documentary inspired by Caroline Walker. She had read Sergey's autobiography in the 1990s and like me, was transfixed by his story. Wanting to make Sergey's account available to a new generation of Christians from 1995 to 1999, Caroline Walker began her research. She would eventually link herself up with her director, I'll just call him Damien, who assisted her with the Soviet-based interviews. The film was finally completed in 2004 and has won numerous awards. I purchased a copy of the documentary and watched it with great anticipation. However, I soon began to feel disenchanted. Instead of telling me more about my newfound hero, the documentary seemed to be pulling apart his superhero cape, thread by thread. Caroline Walker located some of the people named in Sergey's autobiography and sat down with them for interviews. However, instead of providing underpinnings to his story, these witnesses began casting serious doubts about it. Very little, it appeared, was true of Sergey's life and involvement with the secret police. Now, at this point, I need to tell you something about me. I have been a Christian for many years and have served as a pastor, done some missionary work, and am currently involved in prison ministry. However, for over 35 years now, I have also worked professionally as an investigator. As an investigator, one particular area of interest of mine is in the field of deception detection. I have attended many courses on the subject and have even taught a few myself. I've also attended classes offered by the Reed Technique of Interviewing and Interrogation, as well as Scientific Content Analysis School, taught by the former Israeli police lieutenant Avinyam Sapir. Now, I'm not claiming to be an expert in the field of deception detection, but I have had more training than perhaps the average layperson. In any event, as I watched the documentary, I began noticing certain red flags in some of the Russian interviews. To an investigator, a red flag is simply an area of concern that needs to be addressed. It does not necessarily mean that there has been deception, though that is possible. What it does mean is that the investigator must do some more exploring to see if the red flags can be resolved. If you check out the description below, you'll find a link to a blog that I wrote a number of years ago. In that blog, I went through each of the interviews of the documentary in detail. I would encourage you to check it out. In this video, I'm going to play a number of interviews from the documentary and show you some of the things that I saw. In so doing, please keep in mind that I am working with certain handicaps. First of all, I do not understand the Russian language and must rely solely upon the provided translations. Secondly, I have only very short clips to work with. These clips do not provide us with a good baseline of behavior of the subjects prior to the central parts of the interview. Now, with that being said, I should point out that the director of the documentary would have most likely put forward the most compelling sections of the interviews that would support his overall findings. So though we don't have very long clips, we probably have the best sections of them representing the parts that the director must have felt to be the most convincing. So let's take a look now at some of the videos. The first video clip is of a man named Yuri. I won't attempt to pronounce his last name. Sergey had reported that he had recruited his friend Yuri to participate in the violent raids. Sergey had described him as a tall, strong man who loved to fight. Let's watch this interview.
Он пишет, что этот спецотряд, его главная задача это была борьба с верующими людьми здесь.
С кем?
С верующими. Но с христианами. Я короче расскажу теперь. Можно? Так. Он так говорит, что милиция нуждалась в таком отряде, который будет бороться с верующими людьми. Здесь, в Петропавловске.
С верующими?
С верующими. Возможно, чтобы Сергей написал это в книге, что вы вот занимались там избиванием верующих, бабушек, детей, почти там.
Ну, мне кажется, как
Вплоть до убийства. Здесь убийство описывается.
Да?
Да.
Уже...
Это очень серьезно, как вы понимаете, да?
Ну, мне кажется, это, как сейчас говорят, имидж, да? Или что он там хотел создать? Да? Ну, мне так кажется. Ну, а вот так, кто будет читать?
Рекман.
Да.
И он писал о вас это. Оскорбительно это как бы, да? Чтобы вы ему начали сказать.
Да, мне что? Ну, а что оскорбительно? Я так понимаю, ему нужно было продвинуться. Ну, вот как, если так сказать, по-человечески. А чтобы написать, чтобы кто-то читал, значит, нужно было совдепе порядок так, чтобы... Ну, как он? Американцам делать нечего, не заниматься. Вам бы наши заботы, это некогда было. У нас заботы такие, простые.
Okay, let's go back and look at a few things. Now, the first thing we have of interest are the very rapid eye blinks, which seem to start after the word Christians is introduced. At one point, I counted 13 blinks in 14 seconds. I believe that these eye blinks indicate that he is under stress and that the word Christian is what caused it. The next thing of significance is that 3 times this subject answered a question with a question. And this is very noteworthy and is always considered a red flag. However, to be fair, Caroline Walker revealed to me that the Polish interpreter or the Polish translator who was accentuating the word believer was doing it wrongly, making it incomprehensible to him. Although that may be true, it does call for a judgment of what was going on in Yuri's head, which we cannot do. In any event, the translator quickly inserted the word Christian to make it clear. Finally, Yuri is told that he has been implicated in violent raids, which include murder. Yet he never denies it. He never tells the interviewer that this is untrue, and he never indicates that he was not part of it. We should be hearing some sort of denial, but that is not offered. Next up is the interview of Victor, and I'm not going to attempt his last name. Sergey had called him Iceberg Nicky in his book. He was reported to be Sergey's immediate supervisor and the one who ordered the raids into the homes of Christians. Let's go ahead and watch this.
Недолго до этого в кабинет вошел человек и сел в стороне у окна. Сразу можно было угадать в нем военного или милиционера, хотя на нем в данный момент была гражданская одежда, в которой он себя очень неловко чувствовал. Он встал, подошел к нам поближе и представился. Капитан милиции Дмитрий Никифоров.
Виктор.
No,
Ну ладно.
отправляя нас, Никифорос сказал: «Вы долго не разбирайтесь, кто прав и кто не прав. Заканчивайте дело быстро и при любых обстоятельствах, безразлично каким путем». Я, оказавшись в середине побоища, был схвачен двумя парнями одновременно, с которыми я также быстро расправился, применив приемы карате и джудо. Совсем скоро вокруг нас все атакующие лежали на земле. После каждой милицейской бабы направлялись в какой-нибудь бар, где мы ели и пили, развлекались с девушками и лишь затем, вдоволь нагулявшись, отправлялись на свою военную базу.
Как видите, сколько много здесь лжи. Никакой военной базы нет. В то время не было баров. В то время не было карате и дзюдо. В то время было только самбо, самозащита без оружия. Вот сплошное вранье. Почему в устах Коурдакова или издателя этой книги, или кто-то литературную обработку проводил, почему вкрались вот эти искажения, этого я не знаю. Но этого никогда не было.
Он сам об этом говорил, потому что я слышал кассеты с его записью. Но это...
Кассета с его записью.
Стоп. Вы не злитесь на меня, потому что...
Все это выдумки, все это вранье. Как бы Россия плохо не жила, в каких бы мы экономических и политических трудностях на сегодняшний день не были, позвольте, мы люди. Мы люди. И мы еще свою память окончательно не растеряли.
If he is alive, what would you say to him?
Я бы его обнял и поцеловал. Он прекрасный, вот я его помню, живым, прекрасным парнем вот таким. Что дальше жизнь с ним сотворила, как она его изломала, это может быть, в великую беду человек попал, и его достаточно и надо было бы пожалеть. Если бы он сейчас зашел живой, я бы его, я говорю, как сына встретил. А потом бы взял вот эти строки и при вас по лицу бы ему ударил и сказал: зачем ты врешь? Перед кем ты врешь? Перед Богом, которого ты исповедуешь. Зачем ты наврал там? И я бы уверен, если только он остался бы тем Сергеем, которого я знал, он бы сейчас заплакал и сказал бы: да, денег надо, кушать надо. Вот и врал.
What I found interesting in this clip is after hearing from several sections of the book, Victor replies that there is no military base. Yet he uses a different tense when he said there was no bars or judo. I believe that the change of tense is important, suggesting that there had been a military base at one time. But what is more important than that is that when Victor had heard that a raid had been ordered, which left men lying on the floor groaning, and that Sergey and his men afterward went to the bars to drink, that he only denied the bars, karate, and judo. He did not specifically deny the raids or the violence. Again, just like the previous witness, we don't have a strong denial. Now, it's not uncommon for a person who has heard an account that contains both true and false information to focus on the parts that are false if the true parts are uncomfortable. For example, a mother may accuse her son of stealing cookies from the cookie jar and then giving them to his friends. But if the boy took them to eat for himself, he will likely gravitate to the false part of the accusation rather than try to defend the true part. And this could be what we have here in Victor's clip. So what do we make of these interviews? Well, as I've already pointed out, in my opinion, the ones we looked at contain some serious red flags. I don't believe that we find the dogmatic denials that we should expect to find, and some of the body language appears questionable. Does this mean that Sergei's story in the book The Persecutor is true? Well, I don't believe it would be safe to say that. I think there is evidence indicating that Sergei's story was at the very least embellished. However, based on what I can see from these interviews, I'm not prepared to write it off completely. There may be elements of the story which are more true than the documentary would lead us to believe. Now, I want to play one more video for you. It is of Caroline Walker interviewing Joe Bass, or simply Joe Bass. Bass was the president of an organization called Underground Evangelism, of which Sergey had been working for upon his death. Joe Bass was not a stranger to controversy. By the time he had met Sergey, he had already had a significant falling out with Richard Wurmbrand, the famous Romanian pastor who had written the book Tortured for Christ. And by the time Caroline Walker sits down with him for this interview, he's faced even more controversy. As a matter of fact, Bass would go on to face controversy for years to come, often involving legal investigations into his ministry, though it appears that no charges were ever filed. Even in his later years, I found controversy concerning his safe drinking water ministry operating in Panama in around 2012. Now, Bass was responsible for posthumously publishing Sergey's autobiography. Bass and his organization would have reaped the financial benefits of the sale of the book, which sold millions of copies and was translated into, I think, 14 different languages. It's not clear to me when Bass first met Sergey. Some accounts indicate that they didn't meet until early 1972, but some accounts place that meeting in the fall of 1971. It was reported that Bass recorded Sergey's story on cassette tapes. However, he has never released those tapes to the public. After Caroline Walker conducted her Russian interviews, she flew to Costa Rica to meet Joe Bass. Caroline and I have communicated via email, and she informed me that Bass was initially agreeable to the interview. In fact, a lunch had been planned for Caroline and her crew following the interview. As you're about to see, the whole interview went sideways really quick. Let's go ahead and take a look at this.
Did you embellish or exaggerate his story at all?
Sergey approved everything that was written. Sergey made the tapes that were spoken. Sergey stood on the interview and told it himself. Sergey approved everything based in the book completely. So there was repeated what Sergey said.
Was there ever an idea or mentality of, well, maybe his childhood wasn't so bad, but these types of conditions do exist, so...
No, this was told by Sergey specifically, and tape recordings of interviews at that time. This is what happened to him. It stands.
So there's nothing I could tell you that I found out over there that would make you doubt anything about the Sergey's honesty?
Well, you're an American popping in. Now you can parachute into Russia, and you're a nice young lady. You obviously a bit naive. You don't speak Russian. You're going to wind up being directed where whatever it needs to be put in front of you will be put in front of you. I have no idea what your agenda is.
It's so hard to imagine that. I
have no idea what your agenda is. I have no idea.
You wouldn't believe me if I told you I have no agenda. I'm still hoping to find out that the story's true.
Okay, why don't you call your driver and take off, you guys? You're not welcome. Okay? Yeah, go try to trash people somewhere else. No, thank you.
Joe,
I'm not interested.
Absolutely not my intent.
Now, so I'm not going to be a participant in your trashing a kid who isn't alive and can't speak for himself. You have.
I don't understand why you're so defensive.
Let me just say this.
Let me tell you, I put 5 years into this.
What?
I have hoped and shed a lot of tears hoping that the story's true.
Well,
and for you to sit here and tell me that I have an agenda, you are so off base.
I think you have an agenda.
You are so completely...
The first question that Caroline Walker asked was, did you embellish or exaggerate his story at all? Note that Bass never answered that question. Instead, he talked about what Sergey said and did, but never commented what he had done. Miss Walker hadn't asked about Sergey, but only about Bass. He avoided the question. Obviously, Bass's response is highly suspicious. He began blinking his eyes rapidly, indicated that he was under stress. Caroline Walker informed me that they were ordered to leave. The lunch offer was rescinded, and that's where everything ended. One must wonder why Bass became so angry. Was it because he had believed Sergey's story and felt that Sergey was under attack? Or was it because he had embellished Sergey's story and now he was feeling threatened? I believe that had Bass only repeated Sergey's story, then he would have likely answered her first question with, no, I did not embellish his story. This would have safely distanced him from the account should it had ever been proven false. And let me say at this point a few words about Caroline Walker. Before I published my blog and review of her Russian interviews, I let her read it. She has been very gracious to me and has continued to be helpful in my research. I hold her in very high regard. She began her research believing deeply in Sergei's story. Like me, she was very moved by it. However, she eventually came to face with what she believes was just too much evidence to the contrary. It's not an easy thing to change deeply held convictions, yet that's precisely what she did. She did it because she has a commitment to the truth. Even to the very end, it seems she still wanted to believe. She almost is begging Joe Bass to convince her the story was true, which she failed to do. And anyone that committed to the truth simply has my respect, which she does. Okay, we come now to the most important questions. Was Sergei's story in the book The Persecutor true, or was it a lie? Some of the Russian interviews have left me with the impression that it wasn't a complete lie. Joe Bass' interview left me with the impression it wasn't completely true. If the story was embellished, then who embellished it? Did Joe Bass take liberties in juicing up the story to raise more money for his ministry? Or was Sergei the one responsible for misleading so many about his life and activity in Russia? I suppose the only way to know for sure would be to get our hands on that initial recorded interview that Joe Bass made with Sergey, but I doubt that's ever going to happen. So what do you think happened? I'd love to know your thoughts. Please be sure to comment below and tell me what you think occurred and tell me why you think that. In a future video, I plan on discussing the mysterious death of Sergei Kourdakov, and I hope to see you back for that. Thank you for watching.